We've all seen ugly duckling stories, but you have never seen a reveal like Lyra's. This isn't just about a beautiful face. It's about a cosmic power that was bolted behind a rusted iron mask. The moment that metal cracks, the entire world changes, and the Alpha King's reaction is only the beginning of the shock. Just when you think you know how the prophecy ends, the story flips the script. You'll be left questioning everything as Alaric and Lyra attempt to do the impossible, kill a destiny that has already been written. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. I watched the king's favorite lapdog swirl a glass of wine that cost more than a soldier's life, and I wanted to vomit. The ballroom was a suffocating ocean of perfume and lies, a place where every smile was a dagger and every laugh was a trap. Truth be told, I was only here to see it all burn. My uniform felt like a straitjacket, the medals on my chest mocking the men I had buried in the name of a crown that didn't care. Duke Thorne, a voice drawled, dripping with a nectar that tasted like poison. It was Lord Cassian, a man who had never seen a battlefield but loved to talk about glory. The king has summoned you 3 times already. Are you trying to get yourself executed? Or are you just too drunk to walk? I didn't even look at him. Instead, I drained my glass and signaled the servant for another. My mind was a graveyard of memories, mostly of the day the king ordered my battalion to hold a bridge we knew was rigged with explosives. He needed a distraction for his retreat. I gave him 50 dead heroes. Because I was the one who survived, I became the court's favorite tragedy. A broken commander with a sharp tongue and a death wish. Execution sounds like a promotion, I muttered, my voice like gravel. Go tell His Majesty I'm busy counting the holes in my patience. Cassian's face turned a shade of red that matched the silk hangings. But then, a group of debutantes fluttered by, their giggles like the chirping of mindless birds. They looked at me with a mix of pity and disgust. The disgraceful duke who refused to play the game. To make things worse, the king was watching from his throne, his eyes cold and calculating, probably wondering how much longer he could tolerate my existence. You think you're so much better than us, Cassian hissed, stepping closer. But look at you. You're alone. You have no heir, no bride, and soon you'll have no title. I bet you wouldn't even dare to take a wife from this room. In fact, I said, leaning in so close he could smell the bitter whiskey on my breath, I wouldn't marry any of these painted dolls if you gave me the moon on a silver platter. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the alcohol, but I felt a sudden burning need to humiliate them all. I wanted to take their precious standards of beauty and drag them through the dirt. As if fate demanded it, I saw the opening I needed to end my social life once and for all. Let's make a wager, Cassian, I said, a dark smile spreading across my face. I will marry the ugliest, lowest, most wretched woman in this city. I will bring her here, and you will all have to bow to her as my duchess. Without warning, the room went silent. Even the musicians stopped playing. As the silence stretched, Cassian started to laugh, a high, mocking sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Fine, Cassian crowed, his eyes gleaming with malice. The monks at the cathedral have a ward in the kitchens. She wears an iron mask because her face is a nightmare. Marry her, Thorne, and I'll give you my family's northern lands. Just like that, I had signed my own death warrant. What's worse, I didn't even care. I was ready to be the villain in their story if it meant I never had to see their faces again. Chapter 2. The Iron Silence. The cathedral kitchen smelled of damp stone and old grease, a far cry from the lavender-scented halls of the palace. Soon after my bet, I found myself standing before a pair of monks who looked like they hadn't seen the sun in a decade. They led me to the darkest corner of the basement, where the air felt heavy and cold. She doesn't speak, the older monk whispered, his hands trembling. She's been here for 7 years. We keep the mask on because, well, it's for her own protection as much as ours. What followed was the sight of her. She was huddled on a wooden stool, her small frame covered in a tattered gray dress. But it was her head that stopped my breath. A rusted, heavy iron mask was bolted around her skull with only thin slits for eyes and a mesh over the mouth. It was a cruel piece of engineering, stained with orange streaks of oxidation. "She's a monster," the monk muttered. "A cursed thing." Deep down she knew the truth, and so did I. The world hates what it cannot control. I walked toward her, my boots clicking on the wet floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. As if pulled by a string, I reached out and touched the cold, rough metal of the mask. In that moment, I felt a strange vibration beneath my fingertips, like a hum of static electricity. "I'm Duke Alaric Thorne," I said, my voice echoing in the small room. "And I'm here to make you the most hated woman in the kingdom. Do you want to leave this place?" She didn't answer with words. Instead, she tilted her head, and for a split second, I saw a flash of something through the eye slits. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. As the bond pulsed, I felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt in my chest. A feeling I hadn't had since the bridge blew. "I'll take her," I said to the monks, tossing a bag of gold onto the flour-dusted table. "And don't bother with a dowry. Her silence is worth more to me than gold." By the time we reached the carriage, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the cobblestones. Still, I couldn't stop looking at her. She sat perfectly still, her iron-clad head reflecting the dying light. Because I was a man who had lost everything, I found a sick kind of comfort in her presence. We were two broken things, destined to be used as weapons. "They're going to hate us, you know," I told her as the carriage began to move. "They're going to laugh. They're going to call you a beast." Before the words left her lips, if she could even speak, she reached out and placed a small, calloused hand on mine. In the span of a breath, the coldness in my heart seemed to crack. Her touch wasn't just warm, it was knowing. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hide the fact that she was seeing something I couldn't. As the sky darkened, I realized the rust on the mask wasn't just from age. There were fresh, dark stains near the bolts. In fact, the mask wasn't just hiding her face, it was biting into her, which meant my prank was actually a rescue, though I was too proud to admit it yet. Chapter 3. The Crack in the Armor. That night my estate felt like a tomb. I had dismissed the servants, wanting to be alone with my beast. I led Lyra to the master suite, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows against the dark oak walls. Even so, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a sword. "I'm going to have my smith remove that thing tomorrow," I said, gesturing to the mask. "I promised Cassian I'd reveal you at the wedding feast, but I won't have you bleeding to death in my house." As the silence roared, she walked toward the fireplace. She stood there for a long time, watching the flames. Moments later, she turned back to me and began to point at the bolts. Her movements were graceful, almost ethereal, contradicting the heavy metal she carried. As her wolf stirred, or whatever primal instinct lived within her, she stepped into my personal space. "You're not afraid of me," I whispered, my heart skipping a beat. "Why aren't you afraid?" Under the weight of his stare, she didn't blink. She reached up and guided my hand back to the rusted iron. Between one breath and the next, I felt that hum again, but this time it was stronger. It was a roar of white noise that made my head spin. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I saw her fingers tremble. "You're in pain," I realized, the cynicism finally slipping. "The mask. It's not a cage for your face, it's a cage for your mind, isn't it?" Truth be told, I didn't know what I was looking at. Yet, I couldn't look away. I saw the way the metal had scarred her neck, and a sudden violent protectiveness surged through me. Because of that, I reached for a cloth and some warm water, my movements practiced from years of tending to wounded soldiers. Not only that, I found myself speaking to her, telling her about the bridge, the men I lost, and the king who watched it all happen. "I thought I was the only one living in a prison," I murmured, gently dabbing at the rust and dried blood. "But you've been in a dungeon your whole life." As the truth unraveled, her breathing hitched. Without thinking, I leaned in, my face only inches from the iron mesh. The scent of her, ozone and wildflowers, hit me like a physical blow. The space between them burned. Maybe it was fate, but I felt a desperate urge to see the woman behind the metal. 3 days, I whispered, repeating the wager. 3 days, and then we show them. We'll give them exactly what they want, and then we'll leave this rot behind. Before I could move, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. She didn't know what scared her more, the future she saw, or the man standing in front of her. As if fate whispered, I saw a single tear escape the eye slit, rolling down the rusted iron like a drop of silver. And just like that, everything changed. I wasn't just a duke playing a game anymore. I was a soldier who had finally found something worth defending. The air thickened as the clock on the mantel struck midnight, signaling the start of the first day. Wait until you see what happens when the king's blood begins to call to the stars. Chapter 4. The Stricken Bolts. The wedding chapel was a sea of venomous silk and suppressed laughter. Come morning, the rumors of my Iron Duchess had spread through the capital like a plague, drawing every vulture in the court to witness my humiliation. I stood at the altar, my hand resting on the hilt of my sword, while Lyra stood beside me in a gown of shimmering white that only made the rusted iron of her mask look more grotesque. "Do you, Alaric Thorne, take this woman?" the priest asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and judgment. "I do," I barked, my voice echoing off the stone saints. More importantly, I looked directly at the king, who sat on his velvet dais with a smug, bored expression. I wanted him to see the moment I threw my lineage into the gutter. Yet, as I felt Lyra's hand shaking in mine, my spite felt hollow. I wasn't just ruining my name, I was parading a wounded soul in front of a pack of wolves. "The union is sealed," the priest whispered, barely audible over the rising murmurs of the crowd. What followed was the tradition of the first reveal. Lord Cassian stepped forward, a hammer and chisel in his hands, his eyes dancing with the cruel anticipation of seeing a scarred, ugly face. Without a word, I snatched the tools from his hands. I wouldn't let that snake touch her. I placed the chisel against the primary bolt at her temple. As the silence roared, I struck. The first bolt snapped with a sound like a bone breaking. Moments later, the second and third fell away, clattering onto the marble floor. As if fate demanded it, the heavy iron casing split down the middle. I caught the two halves before they hit the ground, and for a heartbeat the world stopped breathing. Between one breath and the next, Lyra's head snapped back. Her hair, a cascade of white gold, spilled over her shoulders, but it was her eyes that paralyzed the room. They weren't brown or blue or green. They were a violent electric violet, swirling with the light of dying stars. And just like that, everything changed. She wasn't the beast they expected. She was a goddess of the void, and the sheer power radiating from her made the air taste like a thunderstorm. Chapter 5. The King's Shadow. Without warning, Lyra let out a scream that shattered the stained glass windows in the clear story. Her body moved on instinct as she lunged forward, her fingers clawing at the air as if she were trying to tear through the veil of reality. Before I could move, she had bypassed the royal guard and seized the king's hands. "The shadow!" she wailed, her voice no longer silent, but sounding like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "The shadow that leaves no footprint. It stands behind you, sire. It drinks from your cup." The king recoiled in horror, his face draining of all color. Because the church had spent centuries hunting the starseers into extinction, the sight of those violet eyes was a death sentence. Not only that, the Grand Inquisitor, a man named Valerius with eyes like flint, rose from the front pew. His hand moved to the heavy silver cross at his belt, which I knew concealed a dagger of void steel. "A heretic," Valerius bellowed. "A forbidden seer has polluted the royal chapel. Guards, seize the abomination." But then, I was there. My sword cleared its scabbard with a hiss of steel, the blade catching the light of the violet fire in Lyra's eyes. Her world tilted and she collapsed into my arms, her skin burning hot to the touch. The mask had been her only protection against the flood of the future. Without it, she was drowning in the currents of time. 3 days, Lyra gasped, her eyes locking onto the king's. 3 days until the crown falls and the earth drinks your blood. The eclipse will be your shroud. To make things worse, the royal guards hesitated. They were torn between their fear of the seer and their respect for my blade. Still, the Inquisitor did not hesitate. He signaled his black-clad, void steel warriors, men who lived outside the laws of the realm. As the wind shifted, I felt the temperature in the room drop. "Alaric, let her go," the king commanded, his voice shaking. "Hand over the witch and I might let you live." "You sent my men to die on a bridge," I spat, pulling Lyra closer to my chest. "I won't let you kill the only truth left in this room. If you want her, you'll have to step over the body of Thorne." Chapter 6. The Flight to Obsidian. Just like that, the chapel turned into a slaughterhouse. Without thinking, I kicked over the heavy oak altar to create a barrier. Moments later, I was cutting through the first wave of Inquisition guards. Their blood splattered against the white marble, a grim contrast to the wedding flowers. Because of that, I knew there was no turning back. I had traded my title for treason, and my pride for a girl who could see the end of the world. "The side door," I shouted to Lyra, though she was barely conscious. She didn't know what scared her more, the soldiers or the visions dancing behind her eyelids. Eventually, we broke through the heavy oak doors into the rain-slicked courtyard. My horse, a black stallion bred for war, was waiting. I threw Lyra onto the saddle and vaulted up behind her. As the sky darkened, we thundered out of the palace gates, the cries of the Inquisitor echoing behind us. "We have to get to the obsidian spire," I muttered into her hair, my heart pounding against my ribs. "It's the only place with walls thick enough to hold off an army." Truth be told, the spire was a ruin, a cursed place where my ancestors had performed dark rites. Yet it was also the only place where the Inquisition's magic was weak. By the time we reached the edge of the city, I could see the first sign Lyra had mentioned. High above, a white crow, a freak of nature, fell dead from the sky, its wings singed by an invisible fire. "The first sign," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "The silence has ended, Alaric. Now the stars begin to scream." As if summoned, a bolt of violet lightning struck the road behind us, illuminating the black-clad riders following in our wake. In the span of a breath, I realized we weren't just running from men. We were running from a destiny that had already been written. But then, I looked down at Lyra's hand still clutching the sleeve of my uniform. Between them, something cracked. My nihilism was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp purpose. Maybe it was fate, but I realized I didn't want the world to burn anymore. I wanted to keep it spinning just to see what color her eyes would be when the sun finally rose. As the bond pulsed, I spurred the horse faster into the teeth of the storm, which meant the next 3 days would either be our salvation or our grave. The tension broke as we crossed the threshold of the Whispering Woods, but the forest didn't feel empty. Before either could speak, a low, rumbling growl echoed from the shadows, and it didn't sound like any wolf I had ever hunted. In the quiet that followed, I wondered if we were riding toward safety, or straight into the jaws of a much older nightmare. Wait until the second sign appears at the gates of the spire, for the shadow is closer than it appears. Chapter 7. The Architecture of Fate. The obsidian spire clawed at the belly of the storm like a jagged tooth. That night, the rain turned to needles of ice, slicking the mountain path as my stallion heaved with exhaustion. Moments later, we breached the iron-bound gates of my ancestral ruin, the heavy chains groaning in a language of rust and regret. I slid from the saddle, catching Lyra as she swayed, her skin still humming with that terrifying electric heat. "We're inside," I grunted, my breath hitching in the freezing air. The walls are 3 fathoms thick, infused with lead and salt. Not even the Inquisition's sight can peer through this stone. Rather than finding relief, Lyra's eyes darted toward the high rafters where shadows swirled like ink in water. She felt it, clear as day. The spire was not just a fortress. It was a conductor for the very energies she now leaked into the world. As if pulled by a string, she dragged her fingertips across the black basalt walls, and the stone seemed to pulse a dull, bruised purple in response. "The air is heavy here," she whispered, her voice trembling as she leaned against me for support. "It tastes like copper and old prayers. Alaric, they are coming. They aren't riding horses anymore. They are riding the wind." Because I was a man trained to see the physical world, I began checking the bolt holes and the arrow slits, my mind mapping out a defense for a war I didn't fully understand. What followed was the sound of a heavy footfall from the spiral staircase. I drew my blade, the steel singing a lethal note. But then, a massive shape emerged from the gloom. Cale, my old master-at-arms, his face a map of scars and silver hair. "Duke Thorne," Cale rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "I figured you'd be back once the sky turned that unholy color. And you've brought a starseer. Do you intend to save the kingdom, or just be the first to watch it crumble?" "I intend to keep her alive, Cale," I snapped, my heart skipping as Lyra stumbled. "The king has 3 days. We have less if we don't find a way to ground her power." Chapter 8. The Price of Sight. Soon after we reached the solar, I laid Lyra on a bed of moth-eaten furs. In fact, her condition was worsening. Without the iron mask to siphon the excess energy, her brain was being scorched by the infinite now. To make things worse, every time she closed her eyes, she saw a different version of my death. A blade in the dark, a fall from the heights, a gout of dragon fire. "I can see the threads," she gasped, grabbing my collar with a bruised strength that bruised. "They're all tangling, Alaric. The king, he's just a knot. If we untie him, the whole tapestry unravels." Without thinking, I sat beside her, taking her small, burning hands in my scarred ones. Maybe it was fate, but the moment our skin met, the violet glow in the room dimmed to a soft, pulsing lilac. My military training had taught me how to be an anchor in a storm, and somehow, my sheer stubborn presence was grounding her. Not only that, I felt a strange phantom sensation in my own mind, a glimpse of a golden meadow, then a flash of a bloody crown. "Focus on my voice," I commanded, my tone the one I used to rally men before a charge. "Don't look at the threads, look at me. I'm the only thing that is real right now." As the silence stretched, her breathing slowed, and the manic light in her eyes began to settle into a deep, soulful violet. Truth be told, looking into her eyes was like staring into the heart of a hurricane, yet I couldn't find the will to turn away. Between them, something cracked. The wall I had built around my heart, the one made of cynicism and soldier's grief, wasn't just crumbling, it was being vaporized. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "You hate the king. You told me the world was rotten. Why save any of it?" "Because," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble, "I've spent my whole life watching things break. I want to see something stay whole for once. And because you looked at my scars like they were a map to something worth finding." As if summoned, a low, vibrating hum began to shake the floorboards. The space between them burned as I leaned closer, my forehead resting against hers. At that moment, I wasn't a duke or a traitor. I was just a man who had found his North Star in the middle of a shipwreck. Chapter 9. The second sign. Come morning, the storm had vanished, replaced by an eerie, golden fog that clung to the mountain like a shroud. Yet, the peace was a lie. I stood on the battlements, my spyglass trained on the pass below. Without warning, the second sign appeared. The fog didn't burn away under the sun. Instead, it began to bleed. Crimson droplets fell from the golden mist, staining the black obsidian of the spire like fresh wounds. "Blood rain," Kyle muttered, standing at my shoulder. "The veil is thinning. The Inquisition's seer eater must be active." Moments later, a shadow detached itself from the trees at the base of the cliff. It wasn't a man, but a creature of twisted smoke and void steel. A harbinger. As the sky darkened even in the midday sun, I realized our time for hiding was over. The Inquisition hadn't just followed us. They had tracked the scent of Lyra's soul. That's why I turned back to the solar, my blood singing with a dark, familiar adrenaline. "They're here," I said as I burst into the room. Lyra was standing by the window, her white gold hair whipping in a wind that shouldn't have existed inside stone walls. Before I could move, she pointed toward the horizon. As her wolf stirred, that primal, prophetic instinct, she let out a low, guttural sound that was half sob and half snarl. As if fate whispered, I saw what she saw through the shimmering air. "The king," she whispered, her voice thick with dread. "He's not in the palace anymore. He's fled. He's coming here, Alaric. He's bringing the shadow with him." Which meant our fortress was about to become a cage. As the bond pulsed, I felt her fear as if it were my own, a cold weight settling in my gut. On the other hand, I saw the way she straightened her back, her violet eyes flashing with a new defiant fire. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the prize in a game that would decide the fate of every soul in the kingdom. "Let him come," I said, my voice steady as I buckled on my sword belt. "Let them all come. I've spent 10 years waiting for a fight that actually mattered." In the quiet that followed, I reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Her bones remembered him, or perhaps they simply recognized the man who would burn the world to keep her warm. And just like that, everything changed. The iron silence was over. The war for the future had begun. Wait until the king arrives at the gate. For the third sign is not a thing you see, but a thing you hear. Chapter 10. The king at the gate. The air turned to glass as the temperature plummeted. By the time the sun reached its zenith, it was nothing more than a pale, sickly coin behind a veil of crimson clouds. I stood upon the high rampart watching the narrow mountain path. What followed was a sight that made my jaw tighten until it ached. A small, bedraggled company of riders, their gold and crimson surcoats caked in frozen mud and blood. At their center, slumped over his white mare, was the king. "Open the gates," he wailed, his voice cracking against the obsidian walls. "Thorne, in the name of the gods, let us in." Still, I didn't move. I looked down at the man who had traded my battalion's lives for a few extra miles of retreat. On the other hand, I saw the 3 black shapes stalking the ridgeline above the royal party, the void steel harbingers, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that defied human biology. Because they were anchored to the physical world by enchanted iron, they left no footprints in the crimson-stained snow. "He brings the plague to our doorstep," Kale spat, his hand white-knuckled on the hilt of his claymore. "If we open that gate, the Inquisition will be inside before the latch clicks." Rather than answering, I looked back at Lyra. She was standing in the courtyard, her white dress fluttering in the unnatural wind. As the bond pulsed, I felt her internal agony. The king's presence was like a discordant scream in her mind. Yet she nodded once, her violet eyes burning with a terrible, sacrificial clarity. "The king is the bait," she whispered, her voice carrying through the freezing air as if she stood right beside me. "But Alaric, if he dies outside these walls, the eclipse will never end. The shadow will find its host." Without another word, I signaled the guards. As the silence roared, the heavy portcullis rose with a shriek of protesting metal. The king's horse stumbled into the courtyard, collapsing as soon as it cleared the threshold. I descended the stone stairs in a blur of motion, my eyes locked not on the sovereign but on the darkness clinging to his shadow. "Thorne," the king wheezed, reaching out a trembling hand. You have the seer. You have to stop it. They're right behind me." Before the words left his lips, a scream ripped through the air. Not human, but the sound of metal tearing metal. Without thinking, I shoved the king toward Kale and drew my blade. In that moment, the first harbinger vaulted over the battlements, its face a smooth, featureless mask of void steel. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Lyra let out a cry of warning, her hands glowing with a blinding celestial light. Chapter 11. The Trance of Dying Stars. The fight was a blur of silver and shadow. Moments later, I was locked in a life-and-death dance with a creature that didn't bleed. My sword struck its armor, sparks flying like dying stars, but the Harbinger moved with a speed that made my military training feel like a child's game. To make things worse, I realized Lyra was the one truly under attack. The creature wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to get past me to the source of the violet light. "Back!" I roared, swinging a heavy torch I'd snatched from the wall. As the wind shifted, the fire caught the creature's cloak, forcing it back for a split second. Because of that, I was able to grab Lyra's arm and pull her into the sanctuary of the inner keep. We slammed the heavy oak doors shut, bolting them with beams of ancient iron. As the silence stretched, we were plunged into a flickering amber gloom. "I have to show you," Lyra gasped, her chest heaving as she slumped against the door. "Alaric, I have to show you why the king survived." Without warning, she grabbed my face with both hands. The moment their eyes locked, the world dissolved. As if fate demanded it, I wasn't in the spire anymore. I was standing in a version of tomorrow, a tomorrow where the sun was a black hole and the king sat on a throne of bone. I saw myself, older and scarred, falling to my knees as a void steel blade pierced my heart. "No," I groaned, the vision tearing at my mind. "Look closer," Lyra cried in the vision. As if the world narrowed, I saw the truth. I died in every single future where the king lived. My death was the price of the realm's survival. More importantly, I saw Lyra's face as I fell. She was being led away in chains, her violet eyes dull and weeping blood. Deep down, she knew the truth, and now, so did I. "You're trying to save me," I whispered as the vision shattered and we returned to the cold stone of the spire. "That's why you didn't want the king here. You're trying to break the prophecy to keep me alive." Her voice trembled as she looked up at me, her eyes brimming with a grief that spanned centuries. "I would let the whole world burn to see you take one more breath, Alaric. What is a kingdom compared to the man who saw me behind the iron?" The space between them burned. Maybe it was fate, but I reached out and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. In the span of a breath, the Duke and the seer disappeared, leaving only two terrified souls clinging to each other in the dark. Between them, something cracked. My nihilism hadn't just died. It had been replaced by a love so violent it terrified me. Chapter 12. The midpoint shift. Come morning, the blood rain had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more ominous. I stood in the center of the great hall, watching the king cower by the hearth. Still, my mind was elsewhere. I was analyzing the fixed point Lyra had shown me. In fact, I was a tactician, and I knew that if you couldn't win the battle on the field, you had to change the map. "The Inquisition is preparing for the final assault," Kale reported, his armor dented and charred. "They've brought up the Seer Eater wagons. They mean to drain her by the time the Eclipse reaches its peak." Rather than feeling despair, I felt a cold, crystalline focus. Because of that, I turned to the king. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who expected to be served. Not only that, he still wore his golden crown, though it was tarnished by the soot of the fire. "You're the bait," I said, my voice as cold as the obsidian walls. "But you're not the target. They want the power she holds. They want to control the timeline." "What are you saying, Thorne?" the king stammered. "I'm saying the prophecy says I die so you can live," I replied, stepping into the light. As the sky darkened, I felt Lyra enter the room behind me. As her wolf stirred, she sensed the shift in my intent. As if fate whispered, I realized that if I was destined to die, I would do it on my own terms, and I would take the Inquisition down with me. "But the prophecy doesn't know me very well," I continued, a grim smile touching my lips. "It thinks I'm a loyal soldier. It thinks I care about your throne." Which meant I was going to do the one thing the Inquisition never expected. I was going to stop being a duke and start being a monster. As the bond pulsed, I looked at Lyra. She saw my thought before I could speak it. She didn't know what scared her more, my death or the man I was becoming to prevent hers. "Alaric, no," she breathed. Before she could move, I took her hand and kissed her knuckles. In the echo of his voice, the plan was set. Just like that, everything changed. I wasn't fighting for a crown or a kingdom anymore. I was fighting for the girl in the white dress, and I would tear the stars from the sky to keep her safe. Wait until the first bell of the eclipse rings, for the shadows are about to find out why they should have feared the Duke of Thorne. Chapter 13. The Burning of the Seal. The golden wax hissed as it hit the stone floor, bubbling like a dying hope. That night, I took my ducal signet, the heavy gold ring that had bound my family to the crown for 10 generations, and I cast it into the white-hot embers of the hearth. What followed was a silence so heavy it felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. I watched the thorn crest melt into a shapeless lump of slag, and with it, the last tether to the man I used to be. "You're discarding your protection," the king stammered from the shadows, his eyes wide with a coward's confusion. "Without that title, the Inquisition will treat you like a common dog. They'll hang you before they kill you." Still, I didn't look at him. I was busy sharpening my blade, the rhythmic shing-shing of the whetstone, the only pulse in the room. In fact, I felt lighter than I had in years. Because I was no longer a duke, I no longer had to care about the proper way to die. I was just a man with a sword and a woman whose heart beat against mine in the dark. "I've been a dog for your crown long enough," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Instead, I think I'll be the wolf that tears the Inquisition's throat out." Moments later, Lyra entered the room. She was wearing the circlet I had hammered out for her, a delicate, stabilizing ring of silver and lead. As the bond pulsed, I felt her strength returning. She wasn't just a seer anymore. She was a beacon. Not only that, she walked toward me with a grace that made my chest ache. Between them, something cracked. The last of my nihilistic armor fell away, leaving me raw and ready for the slaughter. Chapter 14. The Tactics of Despair. Come morning, the horizon was a bruised purple, and the seer-eater wagons had reached the base of our cliffs. Rather than waiting for the breach, I gathered the survivors in the armory. Cale stood at the front, his eyes gleaming with the old fire of a man who knew he was already dead, which meant we were all in agreement. We weren't fighting to win. We were fighting to buy Lyra the time she needed to find a third path. "The Void Steel guards are invisible to her sight," I explained, drawing a map in the dust of the table. "To make things worse, they move in a hive mind, but they rely on their captain's signal." As the sky darkened, I laid out a plan that would have made my old instructors scream in horror. It was a plan of absolute risk. As if fate demanded it, I would lead a sortie into the heart of their camp while the eclipse began. Because of that, the Inquisition would think I was making a desperate run for the king. Rather, I was going for their grounding stones. "You're going to get yourself killed," Lyra whispered, stepping out from the shadows of the forge. Under the weight of his stare, I stopped breathing. I walked over to her, my boots heavy on the stone. Without thinking, I pulled her into a corner, the heat of the forge reflecting in her violet eyes. The space between them burned. Maybe it was fate, but I realized I might never have this silence again. "I've died 1,000 times in your visions, Lyra," I said, my voice thick with a sudden sharp passion. "Let's see if I can't surprise the stars just once." Before the words left her lips, she pulled me down for a kiss that tasted like iron and salt. In the span of a breath, the world narrowed down to the heat of her mouth and the desperate beat of her heart. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I felt a surge of raw, primal power, a connection that transcended prophecy. Her soul answered him, a silent promise made in the face of the apocalypse. Chapter 15. The eclipse begins without warning. The first bell of the eclipse tolled from the valley below. As if summoned, the moon began its slow, predatory crawl across the sun. The light turned a sickly, bruised orange, and the shadows on the ground began to twist and lengthen like living things. Her body moved on instinct as Lyra grabbed her head, her circlet glowing with a fierce silver light as she fought to keep the future flood at bay. "They're moving," she gasped, her eyes flying open to reveal a swirling vortex of violet. The shadow. It's not behind the king anymore. It's moved to the gate. Suddenly, the heavy iron doors of the keep groaned under a massive, invisible blow. The tension broke as the first wave of void steel warriors breached the outer courtyard. In that moment, I wasn't the Duke of Thorne anymore. I was the ghost of every man the king had ever betrayed. As her wolf stirred, Lyra let out a low, guttural cry, her hands igniting with celestial fire to light my way. "Go!" she roared, her voice echoing with the power of a goddess. As the silence roared, I led the charge down the stairs. With every step he took, I felt the weight of the prophecy trying to crush me. Even so, I moved with a tactical unpredictability that baffled the Inquisition's scouts. Because I didn't care about my own life, I was the most dangerous man on the battlefield. I cut through the first line of black-clad guards, my blade a blur of vengeance in the dying light. But then, a void steel assassin detached itself from the ceiling, its blade whistling toward my throat. Before I could move, a blast of violet energy threw the creature back against the wall. I looked up and saw Lyra standing on the balcony, her hair streaming like a banner of war. And just like that, everything changed. We weren't running anymore. We were the storm. Yet as the sun vanished completely, leaving only a ring of fire in the sky, a new sound echoed from the darkness, the mechanical grind of the seer eater. What's worse, I saw a massive shadow snatch Lyra from the balcony before I could scream her name. In the quiet that followed, I realized I had walked right into the Inquisitor's trap. Wait until the darkness becomes absolute, for the descent into the dungeon is only the beginning of the nightmare. Chapter 16. The Crushing Dark. The world didn't just go dark, it turned inside out. That night, the eclipse reached its totality, and the seer eater wagon let out a mechanical shriek that sounded like the earth being torn apart. I watched, paralyzed by a wound in my side that burned like liquid lead, as the void steel assassin vanished into the swirling shadows with Lyra's limp form. What followed was a brutal, systematic slaughter as the Inquisition's invisible guards swarmed the courtyard, their blades finding hearts without the need for light. "Lyra!" I roared, but my voice was swallowed by the roar of the unnatural wind. To make things worse, a heavy mace slammed into the back of my helmet, sending me sprawling into the freezing mud. As the silence roared, I felt cold iron shackles snapping shut around my wrists, void steel, designed to drain the very will to fight. Because I had failed to protect the only light I ever believed in, my nihilism returned with a vengeful, suffocating weight. I didn't fight as they dragged me toward the lower dungeons. I only watched the black ring of the sun and wished it would swallow us all. Moments later, the heavy oak doors of the dungeon slammed shut, plunging me into a silence that tasted like copper and despair. Still, I could hear the faint melodic chanting of the monks above, preparing for the exaltation, the ritual that would drain Lyra's soul to power the king's new, eternal reign. In fact, I was no longer a soldier or a duke. I was just a ghost, waiting for the end. Chapter 17. The Dark Night of the Soul. Soon after, the damp cold of the pit began to seep into my bones, matching the frost in my heart. Rather than fighting the chains, I leaned my head against the weeping stone and closed my eyes. What's worse, I saw her face, not the goddess of the battlefield, but the girl behind the iron mask who had touched my hand with such strange, knowing tenderness. Deep down, she knew the truth, and the truth was that I was a failure who had led her straight into the hands of her butchers. "You look pathetic, Thorne," a voice wheezed from the neighboring cell. It was the king, stripped of his golden robes and shivering in his silk undershirt. Because of that, I felt a flare of pure, white-hot hatred. Not only that, I realized the Inquisition had no more use for their bait. The king was a loose end, and I was just a witness to the funeral of the world. As the silence stretched, I looked at the king and saw the man I had almost died for, a hollow, selfish thing not worth a single drop of Lyra's blood. "Is she still alive?" the king asked, his teeth chattering. "She's being unmade," I rasped, my voice a jagged edge of grief. And just like that, everything changed. I realized that the prophecy was right about one thing. I had to die. But it wasn't the death of my body. It was the death of my duty to you. Without thinking, I began to pull against the void steel shackles. The space between them burned as the enchanted metal began to eat into my skin, smoke rising from the contact. Maybe it was fate, but the pain felt good. It was a reminder that I was still alive. And if I was alive, I could still kill. No matter how hard she tried, Lyra couldn't see a future where I lived because she was looking for the Duke. She hadn't looked for the man who had nothing left to lose. Chapter 18. The Jagged Truth. Without warning, a guard tossed a bundle of trash into my cell, the discarded remains of Lyra's first rusted mask, broken and useless. As if fate whispered, I saw something glinting in the muck near the rusted bolts. It was the shard of the chisel I had used to free her in the chapel. Her body moved on instinct, or rather, mine did. I lunged for the metal, the chains biting into my raw wrists. She screamed your name, the guard mocked, leaning against the bars. Right before the Inquisitor put the siphoning needles in, she won't be remembering you much longer. Before the words left his lips, I had the shard in my hand. In the span of a breath, the soldier's military mind took over. I didn't need a sword. I needed a lever. As her wolf stirred within my own chest, a borrowed fury from the bond we shared, I jammed the shard into the locking mechanism of the void steel cuffs. Between them, something cracked. It wasn't the metal, but the spell holding it together. "You're a dead man, Thorne," the king cried as the shackles fell to the floor with a heavy thud. "I've been dead since the bridge," I said, my voice as cold as a winter grave. "Instead, I am the shadow that leaves no footprint. I am the one thing your stars didn't account for." As the wind shifted through the high dungeon grate, I felt a sudden, sharp spike of violet light through the floorboards above, which meant the ritual had begun. As the sky darkened to a final, absolute black, I felt Lyra's soul reach out one last time, a fading ember in the dark. And she let it happen. She let the darkness take her, believing I was gone. But then I stood up, my eyes reflecting the fire of a man who was about to rewrite the ending of the world. Wait until I reach the top of the stairs, for the Inquisitor is about to learn that some men are too broken to be foreseen. Chapter 19. The Architecture of Spite. The darkness in the dungeon wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical weight, thick with the scent of ozone and dying hope. That night, I didn't climb the stairs like a duke, I ascended like a predator. What followed was a trail of silent broken bodies left in the wake of my jagged shard. I moved through the shadows of the Eclipse, realizing that if I was invisible to Lyra's foresight, I was a ghost to the Inquisition's magic. "The Duke is dead," I heard a guard whisper as I slipped past his station. Truth be told, the world is better for it. Still, I didn't stop to correct him. Rather, I reached the armory and found Kale and the few remaining Thorne loyalists huddled in the dark, their eyes wide with the shock of my return. Because I looked like a demon crawled out of the pit, covered in soot, blood, and the raw burns of void steel, they didn't ask questions. They simply handed me a heavy war axe and a shield of black obsidian. "The ritual is at the apex," Kale rumbled, his voice thick with a new, desperate hope. "To make things worse, the Grand Inquisitor has shielded the throne room with a dome of pure future light. Nothing can touch him." In fact, I knew exactly how to touch him. As if fate demanded it, I looked at the sign I had missed. The eclipse wasn't just a timer for the king's death, it was a blind spot for the gods. Not only that, I realized that if Lyra could see the future, I had to act with such raw, tactical chaos that there was no future to see. Between them, something cracked. My plan was no longer about survival. It was about the beautiful, unpredictable power of a human choice. Chapter 20. The Unwritten Path. Moments later, we breached the upper halls. As the sky darkened to a terrifying velvet black, the spire began to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. Without thinking, I led my small band of nobodies, cooks, stable hands, and scarred veterans through the servant passages. Because of that, we bypassed the main void steel checkpoints, which meant the Inquisition was looking for an army, but they weren't looking for help. "Listen to me," I hissed to my men as we reached the Great Hall's massive doors. "Maybe it was fate that led us here, but today, we break it. When the doors open, don't look at the light. Look at the man holding the needle." Under the weight of his stare, the servants nodded, their faces hardened by a sudden fierce loyalty. As her wolf stirred within my mind, I felt a sudden sharp spike of Lyra's agony through the bond. The space between them burned. She was being drained, her violet light turning a sickly pale white. Before the words left my lips, I felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared the fog of my wounds. "I am the one thing the stars didn't see coming," I whispered, more to her than to myself. Without warning, the first bell of the final hour tolled. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, or rather the echo of it beneath mine, I realized that I didn't need to be a hero. I just needed to be a distraction. As the silence stretched, I gripped the handle of my axe until my knuckles turned white. Her soul answered mine in a faint, flickering pulse of recognition. She knew I was there. Chapter 21, The Breach of Destiny. Just like that, we struck. In the span of a breath, the heavy doors exploded inward as Kale used a siege hammer to shatter the locks. As the silence roared, we charged into a room filled with blinding kaleidoscopic light. The Grand Inquisitor stood over Lyra, his hands buried in a swirling vortex of her energy, while the king's shadow began to stretch and warp into something monstrous. "Thorne!" the Inquisitor bellowed, his voice sounding like grinding metal. "You cannot be here. I have seen the end and you are not in it." "That's the beauty of it, Valerius," I roared, vaulting over a row of stone pews. "Instead of following your end, I'm making my own." Before either could speak, the void steel guards lunged from the shadows. But then, my ragtag army swarmed them, using simple pitchforks and heavy iron chains to entangle the invisible warriors. As the wind shifted, the eclipse reached its absolute peak, and the room was plunged into a strobe light effect of violet and black. Her body moved on instinct. Lyra's eyes flew open, and seeing me alive, she let out a scream that wasn't a cry of pain, but a battle hymn. "The shadow," she cried, her voice echoing with a renewed ferocious power. "Alaric, the shadow is the crown itself." As the truth unraveled, I saw it. The king's crown was the anchor for the shadow that leaves no footprint. Because of that, I didn't aim for the Inquisitor's heart. Rather, I threw my axe with every ounce of my remaining strength, aiming for the golden circle atop the king's head. As if summoned, the weapon spun through the air, a blur of obsidian and spite. And she let it happen. The prophecy shattered like glass. Wait until the axe finds its mark, for the climax is not the end of the world, but the birth of a new one. Chapter 22. The Shattered Crown. The obsidian axe sliced through the air like a reaper's scythe. Between one breath and the next, the golden crown was ripped from the king's head, spinning into the shadows before clattering onto the cold stone. As if fate demanded it, the shadow that leaves no footprint let out a high, metallic shriek as it was forcefully untethered from the world. The dome of future light exploded, sending a shockwave of violet energy through the hall that threw the Inquisitor back against his own altar. "No!" Valerius screamed, his hands clawing at the empty air. The vision was absolute. "The king lives. You must die." Still, I stood my ground, my boots planted firmly in the ruins of the throne room. Rather than falling as the prophecy demanded, I felt a surge of raw, human life force that no star could extinguish. I reached the altar in 3 long strides, my hand finding the hilt of my sword. In fact, I didn't even look at the Inquisitor. I looked at Lyra, who was slumped in the siphoning chair, her violet eyes dimming as the last of the needles fell away. "The prophecy was alive, Valerius," I growled. the blade of my sword catching the first sliver of the returning sun. Because you forgot that a man who has lost everything has nothing left to fear, not even destiny. Without warning, the Inquisitor lunged with his void steel dagger, a desperate final strike. Her body moved on instinct as Lyra threw her hand forward, the last of her celestial fire igniting the air between us. In the span of a breath, the Inquisitor's blade was turned to ash, and my sword found its mark, piercing the heart of the man who had tried to play God. As the silence roared, the light in the room shifted from a sickly purple to the pure golden white of the morning. Chapter 23. The falling action. The eclipse was over, but the world was forever changed. Moments later, the void steel guards collapsed into piles of empty armor, their magical essence evaporated by the returning sun. I dropped my sword and scrambled toward the altar, catching Lyra as she fell from the chair. Her chest ached with the effort of breathing, and her skin was pale as marble, but when her eyes met mine, they were clear, free of the swirling storms of the future. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice a fragile, beautiful sound. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face. "You're really alive, Alaric. I told you I'd surprise the stars," I murmured, pulling her close and burying my face in her white gold hair. Truth be told, I was weeping, the tears washing away the soot and blood of the night. On the other hand, the king was crawling toward his shattered crown, his hands shaking as he tried to piece the broken gold together. I looked at him, the great sovereign, and I felt nothing but a cold, final pity. "It's over, sire," I said, my voice echoing through the ruined hall. "Because of that crown, you almost sold your soul to a shadow. I suggest you leave it in the dirt where it belongs." As the wind shifted, Kale and the survivors entered the room, their faces weary but triumphant, which meant the spire was ours again. Not only that, the word would soon spread that the Inquisition had fallen and the Iron Duchess had saved the realm. But then, I looked at Lyra and realized that we weren't going to stay to hear the cheers. As if fate whispered, I knew we were done with kings and thrones forever. Chapter 24. The New Equilibrium. Come morning, the mountain air was crisp and smelled of pine and freedom. I stood at the edge of the obsidian spire's cliffs, watching the sun rise over a kingdom that no longer owned me. Even so, my heart felt full for the first time since the bridge. I had traded my title and my lands for a life that didn't have an ending written in the stars. As her wolf stirred, a gentle, playful nudge in my mind, Lyra walked up beside me, her hand slipping into mine. "Where will we go?" she asked, her eyes reflecting the gold of the new day. "South," I said, a real smile finally touching my lips. "Rather than a palace, I think a house by the sea would suit us. Somewhere the only thing we have to watch is the tide." As the truth unraveled, I realized that the iron gaze was no longer a curse. It was a gift. The ability to look at the world and see not what it must be but what we could make of it. Maybe it was fate. But as we walked toward the horses, the white crow that had fallen at the gate suddenly twitched and took flight, its feathers turning back to a glossy, natural black. And just like that, everything changed. As if the world narrowed to just the two of us, I leaned down and kissed her, a promise that didn't need words. In the quiet that followed, the spire stood behind us, a monument to a past we were finally leaving behind. Her soul answered mine, a silent yes that echoed through the valleys. And she let it happen. She let the future remain a mystery, and for the first time in her life, she was happy not to know. Epilogue scene. Months later, on a porch overlooking a turquoise sea, a man with a scarred face watches a woman with violet eyes tend to a garden of wildflowers. Beneath the moonlight, she looks up and tells him she sees a long, quiet future for them, one built not by destiny, but by their own choices. As the bond pulsed, he laughed and pulled her close, knowing that some stories are best written one day at a time. The end.